Welcome to Conversations. My name is Brian Joseph. 2 decades ago, the Royal Commission on the Status of Women in Canada lamented the absence of women in public life. More recently, a major Canadian magazine ran a story titled, "The Federal Election, Women Win Big." Closer to home, however, the story is somewhat different. Women are still conspicuously absent in many realms of public life, particularly electoral politics. My guest today is a conspicuous exception to that rule, the first woman to head a major Canadian political party, and the leader of the Nova Scotia New Democratic Party, Mrs. Alexa McDonough. Welcome, Mrs. McDonough.
Thanks very much. Pleased to be here.
I'd like to start, if I might, on a more personal level. Why did you enter politics?
Those are always hard things to sum up in a few words because rarely does one single thing happen or one single decision lead to that. I guess if I try to sum it up, I am a social worker by training and by previous occupation. And I became increasingly convinced that a lot of problems that were being dealt with on an individual level were really the creation of the inequities and injustices in a society that ought to be possible to change, particularly in a democracy. And so I became involved in party politics at the constituency level and then a little bit more broadly and provincially, and just ended up feeling that there was no particular barrier to a woman being involved, and kind of went from there.
Now, if I remember correctly, in addition to all the demands on you in terms of your work in public life as the leader of a political party in this province, you're also a mother of 2 children.
Well, that's right, but you know, if you look closely at most politicians, I think probably it's true to say the vast majority are parents.
Yes.
And the fact that I am a mother with 2 children is notable, in a sense, is more a commentary on how we divide household labor, really, when you think about it. It seems to me that it's probably not noted often enough that most politicians are parents and that family life ought to play a fairly important role in their lives. I often think that the spouses of male politicians play a very major role in the political life of their partner and very rarely get the credit that ought to go with that, because in addition to functioning as a single parent a lot of the time, the spouse of a politician, especially when they live as far away from the legislature as a Cape Bretoner does, for example, in addition to functioning as a single parent, that spouse often also becomes very active in the political life, helping with constituency work, and is rarely acknowledged for it. So I think the fact of my being a woman with children in politics very often helps to lead into a discussion about that, which I think is a subject that doesn't get discussed often enough.
This sounds a little bit like perhaps your work has provided your spouse an opportunity to explore that world, perhaps somewhat more than most men get a chance to explore.
I think that's true, although I think there are also shifting patterns in terms of you know, the working life of families, and therefore outside of the home, and therefore the division of responsibilities within the home. I've frankly been very spoiled by the fact that I represent a constituency that is only a stone's throw from the legislature, and of course I travel across the province as leader, but the major demands on my time are pretty close to home. I suppose I've also been spoiled in a sense by the fact that my husband is very committed to support me in what I'm doing, and I think for a lot of political spouses it's hard to be really enthusiastic about that because it does make such demands on the family.
I was struck by the fact that you described your own progression as being largely without barriers. As somebody who works as a university teacher and who has dealings with many young people, many young women, I often find that they have placed barriers before their own possible careers or progression. For example, I meet many young women who are interested in being nursing assistants, but many fewer who are interested in being nurses or doctors. I meet many young women who are interested in being paralegals, many fewer who are interested in being lawyers. A great many women, for me a troubling number, who rule out possible careers in fields involving science and technology in particular. Is there something out there that presents these barriers to young people, to young women in particular, even before they brush up against them?
Well, I don't think there's any question, you know, that we're socialized by our own experience and we're products of our own environments. And clearly, most role models for these things have been men. There aren't a lot of women who can look around them and see that doctors are men and women in equal numbers, or that politicians have been men and women in equal numbers. It's literally true that until this session of the legislature, there has never been a time, for example, that there has been more than one woman sitting there in the House. And so, you know, considering how the process of socialization really involves people sort of looking around them and saying, gee, I'd like to do that for a living, and there is certainly a gender identification aspect to that. It's not all that surprising, I think, that there are those kinds of limited aspirations or kind of barriers in terms of people really thinking of themselves as moving in certain directions. I think that's changing. I think it's changing slowly. It's changing because people in the field of education, such as yourself, are concerned enough about it to make an issue of it. I think it's changing because gradually, certainly not quickly enough, but finally, slowly, gradually, there are more women moving into occupations that have been traditionally male, and so more younger women can see that and think, well, if her, then why not me? So I think it's changing slowly, but it's a process, and obviously from my point of view, anything that can be done to help accelerate that and remove those, what become real emotional barriers, really, psychological barriers, as well as the many very real concrete barriers that exist to women moving in a lot of directions. You know, the fact that women on average earn somewhere between 58% and 62% what men earn means that women are not often in as good a position financially to make a decision to seek further education or whatever. I mean, there's certainly a historic pattern there of discrimination against women that is slow to change.
I've sometimes heard it suggested that if there were more women, for example, in government, particularly in elected positions where it's possible to exercise certain kinds of decision-making power, that the shape of politics and of public life and perhaps even of international affairs might be somewhat different. Do you believe that?
Well, I think you can fall into a trap in thinking that things are likely to change dramatically just by having women. I don't necessarily believe that. I do think there are many powerful arguments for trying to work towards having more women, and obviously from my point of view something like equal numbers makes sense in a democracy, in a representative democracy. But I think there are some bases for thinking that more women in political life would change the scene somewhat. I think just by virtue of the fact that there tends to be a kind of old boys network and sort of traditional ways of attaining power and wielding power means that with the new entry of a fair number of women, some of that would change because women have not played those games and been in those kinds of traditional roles, and I think the newness of that could change. I think on a global basis there is some basis for thinking that the traditional role of mother, of nurturer, of you know, the child carer and so on may make women somewhat more attuned to those very critical issues that face us today that literally are as basic as the survival of the species. But I think one can overplay that as well. I mean, I think there also is, there are enough examples of women who have attained power that I don't think are particularly exemplary, that make one a little bit wary of thinking if we just get more women in there, we'll solve all of our problems. I don't aspire to participate in the political process based on the role model of Margaret Thatcher, for example. I think that sure, there are some aspects of gender that may be relevant, but I think there are a lot of other things that kind of override that in terms of political values and so on.
It would be nice to think that science, for example, which has traditionally been a man's game, for the most part, because of, as you've sketched, perhaps because of certain kinds of discrimination and barriers, and which has very often been dedicated to the destruction of people and things, might have less of a negative impact if there were some other forces in the decision-making arena that were more concerned with the preservation and enhancement of human life. But as you've mentioned, if one thinks of certain high-profile examples on the international scene, perhaps Margaret Thatcher, some might say Golda Meir and Indira Gandhi, those would be debated. One doesn't see any real clear-cut pattern.
Well, and also, I think, to be fair to the male species, conversely, there are a lot of men who are very concerned about those issues as well.
Yeah.
I just think in the final analysis, it makes sense to have more women involved at all levels of life, because after all, we make up half the population. A
little more, maybe, even, than
right.
half. Let's take a look at some of these issues, then, that you are involved in your work day in, day out, and week in, week out. We have been for a long while in the middle of a very deep recession. I'm surprised that the enormous numbers of Canadians without work somehow have receded from consciousness. There are a great many other problems around us, Africa, for example. Perhaps that's part of the reason. But here in Cape Breton, our people make their living cutting trees, digging coal, pouring steel, hauling fish from the sea, and we have severe problems of unemployment, and those problems hurt a lot, as you've perhaps been hearing. What does your party propose in terms of a development plan for the have-not areas of the province, the southwest area of the province, the northern part of the province?
It's very much our belief that we have to take a fundamentally different approach to economic development. I think we have had a pattern of economic development in this province that goes back a very long ways, that has depended upon a high level of control from outside our own purview. I think there's no question that some of the very deep-rooted problems here in industrial Cape Breton economically go back to the days when basically multinational corporations, in pursuit solely and exclusively of private profit, really exploited our natural resources and exploited our human resources to the point that it set a very, very definite pattern that still takes its toll, or still rears its ugly head. And I think that what we need to do in this part of the province is the same thing we need to do in the rest of the province, and is the same thing we need to do in this country, which is begin to use the democratic process that we supposedly value to begin to govern our own lives, to begin to gain more control over our own economic destiny. Now, it's easy to say that, and it's not so easy to just make it happen. It's especially not easy to make it happen when you have governments in control, both provincially and federally, whose sole idea about what to do to improve our economic lot is to try to attract more foreign investment. It seems to me if there's one thing that we have proven again and again to ourselves in this province and in this country, it is that the very high level of foreign ownership, foreign control in our economy does not work for us. It works for someone else's benefit. I don't know what it takes for us to learn that lesson. Clearly, as a country, we have not really taken that lesson seriously, and in fact, at the moment, are headed on a course that's going to lead us even further down that path. The fact that that happens to be the politically popular course of the moment doesn't alter the fact, in my mind, or in the view of the New Democratic Party, that still is the fundamental challenge. We have in Canada today the highest degree of foreign ownership in our economy of any industrial nation in the world. It's our belief that that's not working for us, and I think it's just a matter of looking at it on a micro level or on a smaller scale to look at the situation in Nova Scotia. When you leave the economic development of the province almost exclusively in the hands of private sector interests, and if you want to take offshore as the most immediate example that perhaps comes to mind, the most topical example, then what you are making a decision to do is basically allow development to take place, not based on any kind of economic goals that you set democratically for your selves as a people, not to exercise your democratic control to ensure that the benefits of economic development get spread in any way, but rather to place yourselves as a people, the people of the province of Nova Scotia in this case, at the mercy of economic forces that operate for someone else's benefit. There are, of course, occasionally some spin-offs from that, and the very nature of the capitalistic system that is becoming more and more a monopoly capitalist system is such that the benefits tend to accrue at the center, and that there is, wherever there is already a concentration of wealth, there will become a greater concentration of wealth. And certainly that system is alive and well and very much in evidence in Nova Scotia today. If you come to Halifax, what you will see is, yes, there is some unemployment. In my constituency of Halifax-Shabukta, we have unemployment, we have housing problems, but you have it in spades here in Cape Breton, because we have, as a political choice, literally elected governments that are going to take us further down that road of increasing the concentration of wealth at the center and increasing the financial risk and the financial hardship at the periphery. We've got to change that. I'm finding it's not so easy to change, but I don't believe less in it than I did when I got involved in politics. I believe more in it, and furthermore, I'm more convinced than ever that it can be done.
That problem you've sketched in Nova Scotia, I think one can also find in our neighboring provinces, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, PEI. Let's look at Nova Scotia for a minute, though, on this particular point. Does your party, for example, have a policy plank concerning the decentralization of economic activity in the province?
Well, you know, it's easy to have a plank, of course, as a political objective, or more importantly, an economic objective. We're committed to policies that would disperse and decentralize as much as possible the economic opportunities and the economic prospects, and that means jobs, and that means services, and that means the economic activity in as many spheres as possible. What's a much greater challenge, it's not so difficult to spell out those goals or to suggest you know, the kind of things that would benefit people. What is very difficult is to engage people enough in the political process to become active in really pressuring governments to act accordingly. You know, I guess the distinction I'm trying to make is that you can have all the policies and all the blueprints as a political party that you want, and they can be as morally correct or economically just or socially sound or whatever as you like. But what the real challenge is to mobilize enough political power to be in a position to either be a government so you can implement those decisions, or at least be in a position to influence the government in such a way that it has to adopt some of those positions. With respect to decentralization, there is no question that there are many, many different ways in which a government serious about spreading the economic benefits could use its power to accomplish that end.
For example?
If you look at the offshore, there is no question that this government made a decision very early on that it was going to let the oil companies do what they wanted. The exact opposite of what was done in Norway, the exact opposite of what was done in Scotland in respect to the North Sea offshore development, where they basically said, look, this is a finite resource, this is something that belongs to us, the people of this country, in this case this province, and we are going to ensure that the benefits from the development of this resource are spread more widely. And the way that we're going to make sure they're spread is, first of all, have some measure of control over the pace of development. Because if you get a government that is hell-bent to try to move ahead and show political signs of activity on the offshore to keep ensuring its own political survival, then it's not going to be guided by sound economic policies. It's going to be guided by political dictates, and that's what's happened in this province, such that the government basically has not concerned itself with having any real control over the pace of development or the pattern of development, and said, we just want to make sure the oil companies are out there doing their thing so people can feel there's something going on there.
Yeah.
And we're not going to try to influence it so that we require that the benefits be spread in terms of decentralizing, in terms of ensuring that some of the servicing, some of the industry spin-offs and so on are shared more widely. We're just going to try to create the illusion of activity as much as possible and as quickly as possible so that people will reward us politically for having somehow been seen to have brought this about. There's no question that when the Minister of Development made this statement very early on in this process, that we don't intend to tell the oil companies what to do. We are going to tell them what our needs are. We know they're going to want to respond. That isn't just naive in the extreme, that is irresponsible in the extreme, because the oil companies make their own rules unless the government is in a position to say, you will do business on our terms,
Yes.
or you won't do our business because it's our resource.
Let's take another example that's perhaps a little closer to government. As important as those private sector industrial activities are, recently in this province we've seen the cancellation at federal initiative of an important decentralization
The Income
program
Securities Office.
that was headed for Sydney,
right,
yes.
Right.
I'm surprised in some ways that the debate about decentralizing economic opportunity and economic activity has taken place mainly at the federal level. If you were to lead a government, what would you do with regard to provincial government jobs, of which there are a great many, now almost exclusively concentrated in Halifax?
Well, I just think there are a great many areas in which you can quite credibly and feasibly decentralize the existing jobs.
Can you be specific?
There are not site-specific requirements to a lot of jobs that the provincial government is involved in. I mean, the Income Securities Office is an example, but let's look at the provincial counterpart. There is nothing that dictates by nature or by definition that all of the social service divisions of the Department of Social Service should necessarily be located in Halifax. They're not site-specific. Couldn't matter less where they're located in terms of being able to provide the functions that they're there to provide. And as a matter of fact, the possibilities and the opportunities for decentralization become greater all the time because of rapid communication developments. I mean, it's a clear example, it seems to me, of where there are all kinds of possibilities for decentralizing jobs now because modern communications technology makes it so easy for us to communicate, between Basing, Lawrence, and Yarmouth, and all points in between. And I think it's a question of frame of mind and the political will to do these things. And the actual doing of them is not all that complicated. Now, of course, you can't naively talk in terms of massive reorganization, massive disruption of existing jobs overnight. But you can, if you're serious about it, get on a track that will allow you to engage in some kind of short-term, middle-term, and long-term planning in pursuit of these kinds of objectives. And the problem in this province today is what planning takes place mainly in the corporate boardrooms and in the sort of bureaucratic backrooms of government, not at all for the benefit of the people of the province, but rather largely for the benefit of big business interests.
Or perhaps in the Halifax Club.
Which is exactly what I'm talking about. That's exactly what the Halifax Club is a concentration of the big business interests and the actors in the back room who very much determine the pattern of both public and private sector activity in this province.
You mentioned earlier the need and the great value of being able to mobilize public opinion and broad public participation to bring about policy changes, and the importance of being within striking distance of power and influence. Your party's position recently has changed in that regard. You're now how many seats behind the official opposition?
Well, we have 3 and they have 6, and 3 doesn't sound like many, and 3 sure isn't enough, but it looks like heaven when you've been there alone as one member, so it's some kind of progress.
You'll have some company.
That's right. It's
Despite
not just a matter of company either, you know, it's really a matter, as of November the 6th,
Yes.
of our being in a position now to have some of the tools with which to do the job that needs to be done. I mean, to really begin to rise to the challenge. Practically speaking, with a single member in the House and without recognized party status, there are many, many barriers to your being able to really fully participate and be much of a political force. Just in very practical ways. As a single member and not in a recognized political party, one's number of questions daily in question period are severely restricted.
Yes.
You don't have the opportunity to respond to ministerial announcements, and much of what emanates from the legislature that the public is aware of arise from those 2 things, from question period and ministerial announcements. So just in very practical ways,
Yes.
it makes a good deal of difference.
So the numbers are important, but despite the numbers, occasionally an idea in itself seems able to attract considerable attention and therefore generate some influence. I'm thinking of the policy developed by your party at the federal level concerning a minimum tax, income tax, on those with high income who often apparently have resources to escape paying any tax at all. Have you given any thought to the matter of tax policy now that an increasing portion of income taxes are levied by provincial governments?
Well, it's actually a very good example of the whole business of political mobilization. I don't think there's any question that if the New Democratic Party had lost its recognized status federally, which was widely predicted to happen in the last election, we would not have any basis for looking forward to any kind of tax reform, because only the New Democratic Party has consistently fought for reforms in the income tax structure that would make the system more fair and more equitable. When Ed Broadbent eked out of Brian Mulroney on the campaign trail, literally in the leaders' debate, a commitment that he would seriously consider ensuring that wealthy people in this country begin to pay their fair share of taxes, you can be darn sure the only reason Brian Mulroney made that commitment was because he realized that public opinion was mobilizing around that idea. It's just so fundamentally fair and self-evident, really, that that ought to be a policy pursued by any government. After all, as Ed Broadbent has pointed out many times, even Ronald Reagan agrees with that, for heaven's sakes. But had the NDP not been reestablished as a significant force federally, the idea probably would have gone out the window. I think now what we are seeing is that a federal government that is not in any ideological sense committed to that policy is nevertheless going to be forced by public opinion and by the fact of a political presence in the House of Commons being there to pressure for it is going to be forced into implementing it. At the provincial level, as I'm sure you're aware, that is an issue on which I campaigned really quite extensively, as did New Democrat candidates across the province, because there is no reason constitutionally, even if the federal government should not be prepared to follow through in its commitment, even if it's going to remain so mean-spirited and basically big business oriented that it's not prepared to move on that policy. There's nothing that prevents the province of Nova Scotia from saying, well, we're going to ensure that the many thousands of wealthy Nova Scotians who paid no income tax last year should be required to begin paying their fair share, and we're going to go on campaigning on that. Again, I think public opinion is mobilizing behind it, because when you have people on fixed income, on pensions, on UIC who pay taxes, what possible justification is there for having thousands and thousands of Canadians earning above $60,000 a year paying no taxes? They, after all, use the same services. They avail themselves of the same public sector amenities as anybody, and they're in a better position to pay their fair share than anybody else.
So we'll be hearing more of this.
We certainly intend to continue campaigning on that issue until we get results, and we won't stop.
We're out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Alexa, one of the things that I would have liked to pursue a little further. Welcome to Conversations. My name is Brian Joseph, and my guest today is Professor A. Wayne McKay of the Dalhousie Law School. Professor McKay has recently authored a new book called Education Law in Canada. Welcome, Professor McKay.
Nice to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you with us so soon after the birth of this baby. Tell us a little about the story behind this book on education law in Canada.
Well, it's been a fairly lengthy project, I guess about 3.5 years in the making, and it started out as a fairly small project, funded in fact by the Nova Scotia Law Foundation to do a handbook for teachers, about 25 pages in length for Nova Scotia law, and it's now grown to a textbook of 400 and some pages for all of Canada. And
it seems to have gotten out of hand a little bit. What happened along the way?
Well, I guess a lot of things happened. I discovered there's a lot of very interesting law, and of course about halfway through the project the Charter of Rights came along and added a number of new chapters and new dimensions, and as I wrote things got larger and larger, so I decided to change the whole format and came out with this.
Well, you probably are aware that some jokes, more or less serious, often accuse your brethren of the legal profession of indulging in length for the sake of profit, but you would argue that there was a lot of new material that came along.
Oh yes, I think so. I'm sure education and law is a bad combination when it comes to being long-winded in written or oral form, actually.
This book, I understand, is something of a unique item in what we have in the country so far. Is that the case?
Yeah, there's no other book at the present time on education law in Canada. There were some early versions of a small part of it in the late 1950s, mostly coming out of Alberta, interestingly, that dealt with particular parts like school boards or students or teachers, but not the whole thing. And they were done not by lawyers, but by education people, so a bit more broad in their interpretation. So this is the only one in Canada at the present time. Lots in the United States. Almost every state has something like this for education law in Ohio and so on, but this is the first in Canada.
So it's, in a very real sense, a new beginning to perhaps a new field?
Oh, I think so. I think there'll be a lot, there is already a lot more writing. There's a lot of writing being done in the area of education law now, and that's going to continue, I think, and I'm sure there'll be other books out before too long, too.
Good. We've been using this phrase, education law. Let's say a little bit about what that actually means. What's it about? What does it cover?
Okay, it covers a lot of areas that would be in the range of law courses and normal law disciplines, I suppose. I suppose the simplest way to put it is it's the law as it applies to the whole field of education. That's really what I attempted to do. So we go all the way from Charter of Rights issues about students' rights, teachers' rights, parents' rights, if you like, in the kind of civil liberties sense. Very specific things like copyright law, negligence law in respect to accidents on the playgrounds, corporal punishment, rules about discipline and dismissal of teachers and or students, I guess constitutional issues about jurisdiction, what's the power of the school board, what's the power of the federal government and provincial government. So I guess the short answer, I'd say it's most of the law courses applied to the school setting.
Okay. Does it apply just to the public school system? Would it cover also, for example, colleges and universities?
Okay, that's a good question. In its present form, it does just apply to secondary schools, although I do make some allusions to private schools and universities. Second edition, which we're already talking about, we probably would try to include that because I've had a lot of people interested in what's the position of a private school, what's the position of a university. I think there are some rather distinct differences, so the major application here is to the secondary school.
The charter, which has become a part of the legal landscape in Canada recently, seems to be suggesting all kinds of new developments in various fields. In a general sort of way, can you say what it looks like the charter may mean for the conduct of schooling in the secondary system?
Okay, that's an important but very difficult question.
Is that your whole book? Or?
It's a good part of it, about 3/4, I'd say. It's difficult for two reasons. One, the charter is very new. The 1982 date is when it first came in, and then most recently, just a month ago, the equality provisions came in. So we have very little case law, very little interpretation of it. We have a lot of American experience, European experience, other places to look at, but we're not really sure yet how much that's going to be translated into Canadian terms. Canada is not necessarily going to come up with the same solutions that the United States did, or that England did, or France did. The other, perhaps most important reason it's hard to answer that question is that the charter itself has some escape hatches. There are a lot of guaranteed rights, but the rights themselves are fairly open-ended, and there's a very important protection that says all the rights are subject to reasonable limits. Well, what are the reasonable limits? That's the big question, I think. What are reasonable limits on free speech for students? What are reasonable limits on academic freedom of teachers? The Jim Keegstra, Alberta case, is that free speech for Jim Keegstra to teach anti-Semitism as a form of history? What are the limits on cruel and unusual punishment? So I guess to answer that, those are the difficulties. Now to try to answer in some form your question, I think there will be a significant impact mainly on the educational front, that people will become more aware of the charter and try to act in accordance with the charter before it ever goes to court. I don't personally think there will be a great flood of court cases. There will be more than we've had in the past, but it costs a lot of money to go to court. So I think there will be an impact, but it'll be more an impact, quite frankly, by the kind of thing that I guess I'm going to be doing in Sydney, in-servicing people, administrators and teachers themselves becoming aware of the charter and trying to meet the spirit of the charter. And only in the more extreme cases will there be court challenges. That's what I'd see the impact as.
Could we call some of this work that's brought you to our area something like a kind of preventative legal medicine?
Yeah,
is that
I think it is.
the spirit of the thing?
Yeah, I think it is. And in fact, I've done quite a number of these in-services, and I guess that tends to be my pitch, that it's better for everybody, for you, the educators, for the parents, for the students, to try to put your own house in order rather than waiting for the whole thing to go to court. Now, the difficulty of that is predicting what a court will do, but I think that's a lot of my message.
Okay, before we get into some of the specific areas that are of particular interest to teachers and parents, maybe we could take a small step back and just say a bit more about the charter as such. Without getting into the detailed provisions of the charter, how does that change the way we've laid down the legal framework for our Canadian society? I mean, how important is it?
Okay, I think it's quite important. It's important for a number of reasons. First of all, it is a constitutional charter of rights. It's not a regular statute. It cannot be set aside by a regular vote in the legislature or the federal parliament. It's part of our constitutional structure. And what that basically means is it's harder to change. It's more fundamental. Now, as I mentioned earlier, just how extensive it'll be will depend a lot on judges, depend a lot on how much broad reading they give to the words, how expansive they are. And I suppose that in itself isn't one important impact. I think the charter has given our judges a lot more political authority in the broad sense, policy authority, than they had prior to the charter. and in that sense moved us a little bit more towards the United States, because in the United States, of course, the American Bill of Rights has put judges in a fairly important policy-making decision for a long time. Brown and the Board of Education, the desegregation case, one of the most significant probably decisions in all of American educational development, but it was a Supreme Court decision. So I think that's one change. It's moved a lot of power to the courts that wasn't there before. The other change, I think, is just thinking in terms of civil liberties, thinking about rights. I mean, in putting it in the school context, to think of rights of students is a fairly novel idea in Canada, and I think that's an important impact. And I suppose perhaps another important impact is the fact that the governments are more limited. The governments now have to make laws, make regulations, taking account of the Charter of Rights, and if they don't, they may be set aside. And we had a couple of good examples recently. The Sunday closings law, the Lord's Day Act, that was found to violate the Charter and is struck down. It has no impact. And similarly, although they decided the other way in the cruise missile case, they said that the Cabinet could, in the right case, be checked by the courts. If the Cabinet, even the federal Cabinet, did something that was contrary to the Charter, then that was going to be struck down. Now that's very unusual.
Or at least citizens had a right to challenge.
At least they had a right to challenge. And if they found a violation, they would strike it down. They did not find any violation in respect to the cruise missile. But there could be a case where they would. And in classic Canadian political science terms, to challenge the Cabinet or the legislature is really unorthodox,
Well,
heresy.
challenging the monarch and almost God.
Well, pretty close, pretty close. And they probably can challenge the monarch too. I mean, at least
Really?
the representatives of the monarch.
Okay. From the point of view of a layman, could we say that the Charter is a statement that sets out in fairly straightforward terms, rather than as a kind of summary from cases that have been decided, a list, as it were, of entitlements and rights that citizens have? If that's the case, is that the case?
That's basically
Okay.
it.
If that's the case, is that a sign, in fact, that as a national community, we are moving closer to an American way of living that has always seemed stronger on individual rights than perhaps the Canadian interest in social or group obligations?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because I think you're right. The American tradition has been individual rights oriented. The Canadian tradition, to the extent we've talked about rights at all, we tend to think of group rights, like language rights, which is a group right, denominational schools rights, which are group rights. I think the answer to your question is we've moved more towards the American, but there are parts of the Charter that are still quite collective or group in their orientation. One of those being the very first section, which states that all the rights are subject to reasonable limits in a free and democratic society. Now, what the judges have said already about that is that they're really looking there at majority interest. What is the collective interest here? Granted, some individual has a right to free speech or freedom of religion, but what are the countervailing collective social interests? So that's one section. Equality rights, in a way, could be seen as group rights. The rights of the racial minorities, the rights of women, the rights of the handicapped. So in a sense, that's group rather than individual in its orientation. Denominational schools themselves, the religious-based schools, are exempted from the Charter. Language rights, minority language rights are
Now
group.
let's repeat that point. Denominationally based school systems are exempt from the coverage of the Charter.
They are, surprisingly. Section 29, yeah.
I see.
Negotiated in fact, by Premier Peckford and a few others, provinces who have denominational schools, because if they did not get that clause in there, most of the schools would be invalidated as religious discrimination. I mean, that,
So we're saying that in order for these school systems to survive, the Charter had to make special provisions to say this isn't religious discrimination to have a separate school system.
That's effectively what they say.
But does it also thereby deprive people working and going through that system from the rights that they would be guaranteed?
Absolutely. I mean, it means, I would think they're going to say what it means is that religious discrimination and arguments can't be used in the denominational schools, that it's okay to fire a teacher for being not being a good Catholic, or it's okay to not hire a teacher because of their religion. All of which, if they weren't denominational schools exempted, would be religious discrimination.
Okay, let's go from this interesting point to a particular case that one can think of and perhaps even recall from recent news. Let's say as a parent I thought that I was a real believer in the old Roman dictum about sparing the rod and spoiling the child, and I wanted my kids to receive physical discipline of the sort that I suppose you and I might have gotten in the days in Nova Scotia when the strap was pretty common. Does that mean that if they were enrolled in a religiously based or controlled school system that that teachers there might in fact be able to say strap the kids in a way that they could not in the public schools?
Okay, now that's
how would that sort out?
I think not, unless they could establish that that's part of, and this might not be impossible, part of the religious orientation of the school. The exemption for denominational schools relates primarily to the maintenance of a separate religious structure. Now, not impossible to think about religious structures that do connect with, I mean, spare the rod and spoil the child has biblical connotations, I guess, so there may be a connection, but in general, they're talking about the religious side. Now, interesting question, the broader question, though, about how the protections against cruel and unusual punishment in the Charter may limit or eliminate the strap from schools altogether, and there will undoubtedly be challenges to that in both the probably denominational and the regular school system.
What's the status right now of the I almost said good old strap?
Good old or bad old, I guess it's not banned by statute. There's nothing in our Education Act that talks about it in either a positive or negative way, which is the case in most provinces. I think the only province in Canada that actually bans the strap is British Columbia, interestingly. Newfoundland, I think, is the only province that actually has a provision that says it's allowed right in the statute. Practically, though, most school boards have banned it. Most schools and school boards have banned the strap.
So if I'm a teacher, I know this. If I'm a teacher, I'm told by my principal or by some documentation I get from my union or...
That's right. School board regulations, sometimes school regulations, job descriptions, a number of... However, that's not universal, and recently there was a case in Bridgewater where the strap was applied. There are, even within a single school board, there are some schools that apply the strap and others that don't. So it's a local policy level is where it's at now, which in itself is somewhat discriminatory. In other words, if your child goes to one school district, they may be subject to the strap, and if you go to another, they may not. Or in some case, one school is different from another school in the same district.
Yeah. It sounds like the kind of almost patchwork effect we get with censorship standards in some communities or smoke, no smoke bylaws in some towns and in some cities. Which,
by the way, raises an important broad issue under the Charter. When they say reasonable limits, one of the big questions about rights is what standard do we apply to reasonable limits? Is it Canadian national standards of reasonable limits? Is it provincial standards about what are reasonable limits, or is it local standards? And that makes a big difference in some cases.
Which is it?
Well, no, you don't know yet. I think it's going to be no smaller than provincial standards. I think there's going to be quite an argument that it's national standards, that what's cruel and unusual in Toronto is also cruel and unusual in Halifax or Sydney or Glace Bay. But we don't know that yet, really.
I see. The discipline issue, and I suppose we think of it in very concrete terms when we discuss something like the strap, that was pretty common in my school days here in the Maritimes. Touches and raises, this question of discipline raises a number of related specific examples. One thinks about the problem of school children not attending school, truancy, for example. Does your book, in examining the Charter and other parts of education law, have light to throw on what means and what possibilities teachers can avail themselves to deal with that problem, discipline problems in the classroom? Where do teachers stand on an issue like discipline in the classroom, and I suppose extending that, a problem that prevents kids even from getting to the school or class at all? Okay,
well, two separate questions. They're related, but they're separate, I guess. Let me answer the truancy one first. There has recently been a court challenge under the Charter to the provisions under the Education Act dealing with truancy, and in fact the result of that court case was to say that the present arrangement whereby a child could be sent to a reformatory for, I think, up to 7 years for truancy was struck down as being either cruel and unusual or too uncertain, arbitrary detention, a whole number of arguments.
Okay,
Anyway.
just by way of background, what does the law say in terms of the obligation of parents to send their children to school?
It states two things, that in fact the parent is obliged to send their child to school, and if they do not do so after making reasonable efforts, they themselves can be fined under the Education Act, and that's still intact, that parents can be fined for failing to send their children to school. Few exemptions, not very many. One of the most interesting ones that tends to come up is whether you can remove the child or not send the child for religious reasons. You want to keep your child at home, or you object to the sex education class, or you object to secular education generally, and there have been even already some case law on that. So there's the parent's obligation, but then secondly, the student can be charged with truancy under the Education Act, and under the previous arrangement could have been sent, as I say, to a reformatory for as much as 7 years. Now, they rarely were ever sent that long, but that was what the Act permitted. The case struck that down, and actually the government has responded by introducing new provisions just in the last week or so, or 2 weeks, on truancy, saying that they can't anymore be sent to reformatories, that what they do is they report to social services, who then may want to argue that this is a case of neglect, that the children not being sent to school may be a case of parental neglect, but it's handled now more through social service, or will be. So that's a very interesting illustration of direct charter impact. The truancy provisions in respect to the child have been wiped out as a result of the charter at the present time in Nova Scotia.
Really interesting illustration. To continue on that line for a moment, what if a parent wants to keep a child out of school? Margaret Mead says at the front of her autobiography, my parents wanted me to get a good education, so they kept me out of school. I don't know how long, but what if they want to take their child on a field trip? What if they want to see a reenactment at the Bell Museum in Bedeck or something? What if they want to educate them at home?
Well, there are provisions at present. If you have a approved alternate education, you can get exempted from the general rule. The general rule is compulsory education. Everybody sends their child up to age 16, I believe it is. You must send your child to school. There are certain exemptions in the regulations, one of which is an approved alternate education, but the approved, I suppose, is the critical thing. What kinds of programs are approved, how are they approved, that sort of thing. So if it's approved, no problem. If it isn't approved, and if it's persistent, I mean, one day here and there to go off to Lewisburg is not going to be a problem.
Yeah, you have 4 children, I think,
yes,
according to the dedication of the book.
Yeah.
On some bright, wonderful, sunny spring day, you don't have classes at the law school. You just might want to take the kids to Point Pleasant Park or the Citadel.
It's no problem. I mean, that kind of thing is not going to get you into truancy problems. But the real concern is when it's weeks, many days in succession, that kind of thing. And where it is more frequently a problem is where there is some conscientious objection that they really do want, like Margaret Mead, want some alternate education. They don't like what's happening in the schools.
It becomes an issue or a kind of challenge in principle, could we say?
Yeah. Now, to come to your second question about teacher discipline in the schools, when I do these seminars, that's an issue that frequently arises. A lot of teachers, I think, have a sense that their powers have been eroded.
Are they being eroded?
Somewhat, yes. I don't think nearly as much as they tend to think, that there are fewer provisions open to teachers now. For example, a strap is fairly limited where it's around. Even where the strap is allowed, it's normally now restricted to the principal with a witness. The teacher can't do it. The powers of suspension, both from the class and from the school, now have been limited in terms of how long you can suspend, rights to a hearing after the suspension for the student. So there's more, I suppose from a layman's point of view, more red tape. From a lawyer's point of view, more due process in these kind of things, which I suppose is a kind of limitation. And I guess there's some sense, and I don't have any basis for this at all, but I get the sense sometimes from teachers that they feel that administrators and boards perhaps are not willing to back them as much on discipline matters, so that if they're going to take a hard line, they're going to put their neck on the line, and therefore they're concerned about that. My own view is that if that is true, it's less a matter of what law is doing than it is a changing social attitude. That really what's happening
about
is
authority generally.
About authority generally, and particularly a changing social attitude about what you can do to students or what you can do to children. I mean, we see that just in terms of the child abuse laws. I mean, there's been quite a remarkable extension, and I would say improvement on that. A few years ago, we didn't think there was a child abuse problem. I'm sure it was there just as much, but we didn't define it as such. So I think my own view is, yes, there's some erosion of authority, but it's less a legal matter than it is a social development matter. We just don't quite accept the same kind of fairly rigid, you know, everybody sits in the row and you get the ruler across the knuckles if you get your math wrong, which is not acceptable anymore, as a social matter more than a legal matter.
So in that way, would it be, in your view, correct to say that teachers may be facing some increased difficulties, but they're similar to the sort that parents themselves face in disciplining children, and perhaps especially teenagers?
I think that's right. Some significant additions to teachers, the numbers, there's not too many parents that have 30-odd children at one time.
Indeed.
And so they've got a much more difficult situation that way.
Yes.
But there are some similarities, certainly. An interesting little point as an aside on the Charter. The Charter applies to government action, but not to private action generally. So the parents would not be restricted by the Charter. They would be restricted by other things like child abuse laws, human rights laws. But the Charter would apply to the schools as a government agent, a public agent.
And to the teachers as employees.
And to the teachers as employees, but
so
not the
parents. So we're not going to get
parents.
into this legal hair splitting we had with the Holland case in Halifax, where
Well,
the city
I'm sure
spent
we will, but
several $100,000 to defend the policemen, and yet maintained that they weren't employees. And so
Yeah, no, I don't think
teachers
so.
are employees of the government.
Yeah, in fact, they've, in other areas such as negligence law, they've tended to pretty generally stand behind the teachers. If they're acting in the course of their employment, then we're going to stand behind them as their employer. Yeah, I don't think we'd get into that.
Okay, glad to hear that. Let's explore one other possible area of particular interest. Maybe we could call it special needs, and I'd like to explore this by means of a concrete local example. In the community here, and I suspect in other areas of the Maritimes as well, there may be numbers of a language group who are guaranteed rights under Canadian law, and especially the new Constitution and the new Charter, and I'm referring in particular to claims for French language education. I've been told that the Charter contains some guarantees or points in the direction of students being entitled to an education of some sort, or perhaps those guarantees come from elsewhere. But in any case, will the Charter, and does your book throw light on this question, allow groups of parents to say, we want our children educated in French, or perhaps even Ukrainian, or perhaps Gaelic in Inverness?
I'd be surprised if you were going to leave out Gaelic in Cape Breton. But no, I think that's a good question. Section 23, the minority language provision, is quite clear that there is a requirement, interestingly not guaranteed to students, but rather to parents, which I think is an interesting point in itself. The relevant section of the Charter says parents have the right to have their child educated in the minority language. And I think that's very significant, at a point I develop in the book.
The minority language meaning French.
Meaning
here.
French here, English in Quebec and so on. But I think the interesting, just a quick tangent related point, is that a lot of the rights for students tend to be through parents. And we assume, perhaps sometimes too quickly, that parents' and students' interests always coincide. They don't always, but that's sort of another issue. So there is clear guarantee for the two official minority groups, French in a setting like in Nova Scotia, English in a place like Quebec.
You have two of your children in French immersion.
That's right.
There's no French immersion here to speak of. And some in the community feel that children without access to that are going to suffer a great disadvantage. Can parents argue for that under some kind of legal provision now?
I think they might well be able to do that, not under the minority language provision itself. There's an interesting debate about whether French immersion is protected by the minority language, because, I mean, I'm not, in a sense, the person the Charter was aimed at. I'm not, unfortunately,
Your
I'm not
mother
an
tongue
Acadian.
wasn't French,
No,
for
unfortunately,
example.
I'm not Acadian,
Okay.
and therefore I wasn't the kind of person that was intended to be benefited by that, but I do happen to have children in French immersion. So whether my kind of situation is protected itself is one question, but your point is perhaps an equally important one. If Halifax, for example, has an extensive French immersion program, and we now have a Charter that says everyone has the right to equal benefit under the law and equal protection of the law, why can't a family in Sydney or Glace Bay say, well, why does McKay in Halifax get his kids in French immersion and I have no such option?
Good
Is that
question.
equal benefit?
Good question, and I'm afraid we have to end on that point. I want to thank you very much for helping to throw some light on what the Charter may mean, and as well in the areas which your book may assist with.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us today. This question about the entitlement of parents toward education.
When I was a little girl, for instance, I never bought anything messed up. But now,